Hey everyone, welcome back to another descent into the beautiful nightmare that is human history. Tonight we're diving into something that makes your worst food poisoning experience look like a spa day. We're talking about Herod the Great, the king who literally rotted alive while still trying to run a kingdom. So before we get into the delightful details of decomposing royalty, go ahead and smash that like button if you enjoy watching me destroy your faith in human dignity. And subscribe if you want more stories about historical figures who learned the hard way that mortality doesn't care about your crown size. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always amazing to see how many of you are choosing to spend your precious free time learning about ancient people's spectacular failures at staying alive. Some of you are probably eating dinner right now. You might want to reconsider that choice by the end of this story. Now, find yourself a comfortable spot. Maybe grab a drink, you're going to need it. And prepare yourself for a tale so grotesque that ancient historians had to tone it down because they were worried people wouldn't believe them. We're talking about a death so horrible that it makes medieval torture devices look like massage chairs. So you think you understand power, do you? You think you know what it means to be untouchable? To have absolute control over life and death. Precious. Like watching someone try to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. Tonight, we're going to meet a man who had more power than most people can imagine, who built monuments that still stand today, who commanded armies that conquered nations, and who discovered that none of that matters when your own body decides to stage a revolt that would make the French Revolution look like a polite disagreement. This is the story of Herod the Great, though by the end you might question whether great refers to his achievements or just the sheer magnitude of his suffering. This is a man who killed his wife, his children, and pretty much anyone else who might have posed a threat to his throne, only to discover that his greatest enemy was hiding inside his own skin, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to turn his body into a horror show that would traumatize everyone who witnessed it. We're going to explore how a king, who thought he could control everything, learned that there's one kingdom no ruler can ever truly command their own flesh and blood. We'll see how the man who made others suffer experienced agony that redefined the very concept of pain. And we'll discover that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe delivers justice with such poetic precision that it almost makes you believe in cosmic karma. So settle in, because we're about to spend some quality time with a man whose death was so spectacularly awful that it became the gold standard for what happens when you're a terrible person and biology decides to get revenge. This isn't just history, folks. This is history with a sense of humor so dark it makes Edgar Allan Poe look like a children's birthday party entertainer. Fair warning, if you're squeamish about bodily functions, parasites, or the general concept of human flesh deciding to quit its job while you're still using it, you might want to sit this one out. But if you're ready to explore one of history's most perfectly ironic deaths, then welcome to the story of the king who discovered that absolute power corrupts absolutely, but absolute decay corrupts even more absolutely. Picture this. You're the most powerful man in Judea, maybe even the Eastern Mediterranean. You've got palaces, armies, a construction budget that would make modern dictators weep with envy, and enough paranoia to fuel a small war. Your name is Herod. They call you the Great. And you're about to discover that all the gold in Jerusalem can't buy you a death that doesn't involve your own body becoming a horror show that would make plague doctors quit their jobs. But let's back up, because before Herod became a walking advertisement for why absolute power corrupts absolutely, and before his intestines decided to stage their own rebellion, he was just another ambitious sociopath clawing his way to the top of the political food chain in 1st century BCE Palestine. Think of him as the ancient world's answer to a mob boss with delusions of architectural grandeur. Herod didn't start as king. Nobody handed him a crown and said, "Here, go build some monuments and murder your family." No. He earned his throne the old-fashioned way through a combination of military brutality, political maneuvering, and sucking up to whoever happened to be running Rome that week. This was a man who understood that loyalty was a commodity. Morality was a luxury he couldn't afford, and family gatherings were just opportunities to identify future threats. The year was 40 BCE when Herod first got his hands on real power, and the Roman Senate, in their infinite wisdom, decided this half-Edomite, half-Jewish opportunist was exactly what Judea needed. They named him king, not because he was beloved by his people, quite the opposite, but because he was the kind of useful monster who could keep the region stable while funneling tribute back to Rome. Think of him as middle management with a crown and a serious impulse control problem. Now, Herod wasn't stupid. Paranoid, yes. Homicidal, absolutely. But stupid? Never. He understood that being king meant being constantly surrounded by people who wanted him dead, starting with his own family. So he did what any reasonable psychopath would do: he killed them first. His wife Mariam, dead. Her mother Alexandra, dead. His sons Alexander and Aristobulus, dead. His eldest son Antipater, dead. And just 5 days before Herod's own demise, because apparently the man believed in cutting things close. But here's the thing about karma: it doesn't care about your title, your palaces, or how many people you've had executed. It just sits there, waiting, like a cosmic debt collector with infinite patience and a really twisted sense of humor. And Herod's bill was about to come due in the most grotesque way imaginable. The first signs appeared around 4 BCE. Herold was in his late 60s, which in ancient terms meant he was practically mummified already, but this wasn't normal aging. This was something else entirely. It started small, a fever that wouldn't break, an itch that couldn't be scratched, a general feeling that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with his body. But Herod was a king, and kings don't get sick. They get temporarily inconvenienced by their mortality. The physicians came first. Not just any physicians, mind you, but the best money could buy. Greek doctors with impressive beards and even more impressive theories about bodily humours. Egyptian healers with mysterious potions and cryptic diagnoses. Jewish physicians who whispered prayers while examining their patient, and probably wondered if this was divine punishment for all those murdered family members. They poked, they prodded, they consulted their scrolls, and they all came to the same conclusion: they had absolutely no idea what was happening to the king. But they were pretty sure it wasn't good. The itching got worse. Not just uncomfortable worse, but I would rather be crucified worse. Imagine the most intense itch you've ever experienced, then multiply it by 1,000 and make it cover your entire body. That was Herod's reality, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His servants would find him scratching until he bled, clawing at his skin like a wild animal trying to escape its own hide. The royal fingernails, once perfectly manicured symbols of power, became instruments of self-torture. But the itching was just the opening act. The real show began when his feet started swelling. Not cute, I walked too much, swelling, but horrific, monstrous inflation that turned his extremities into grotesque parodies of human anatomy. His feet became so enlarged that he couldn't wear shoes. His hands puffed up like inflated bladders. His face, once the commanding visage of a king, became a puffy, unrecognizable mask that horrified anyone unlucky enough to look at it. The smell came next. Oh, the smell. It started subtle, just a slight off, putting odour that servants attributed to old age and rich food. But it grew stronger, more putrid, more unbearable with each passing day. It was the smell of decay, of something rotting from the inside out. Palace staff began drawing straws to see who would have to attend to the king. The unlucky ones would hold perfumed cloths to their faces and breathe through their mouths, trying not to gag as they performed their duties. Herod's bowels, apparently deciding they wanted in on the rebellion, began producing what the ancient historians politely described as violent discharges. Modern medical interpretation suggests this was severe diarrhea mixed with blood, pus, and tissue from his disintegrating intestinal lining. The man who once commanded armies now couldn't command his own digestive system. Royal chamber pots became instruments of horror that even the most desperate servants refused to empty without covering their faces. His genitals, and this is where the historical accounts get really uncomfortable, became the star of this grotesque show. They swelled to enormous proportions, became covered in what Josephus describes as worms, and began producing a constant flow of putrid discharge. Modern historians debate whether these were actual parasitic worms or just the poetic language ancient writers used to describe necrotic tissue. But either way, the result was the same. The most private parts of the king's anatomy had become a public horror show that no amount of royal dignity could conceal. The worms weren't limited to his genitals. They appeared everywhere on his body where the flesh was rotting. Servants would watch in fascinated horror as these creatures emerged from open sores, feeding on the king's living tissue. Whether they were actual maggots attracted to the decay or some other parasitic infection, they turned Herod's body into a living autopsy, consuming him while he was still conscious enough to feel every moment of it. Sleep became impossible. Not just difficult, impossible. The pain, the itching, the smell, the constant awareness that his own body was devouring itself from within kept Herod in a state of perpetual, tortured consciousness. He would lie in his palace chambers, surrounded by the finest linens and most beautiful decorations in the kingdom, and experience a hell that no artist had ever imagined and no poet had ever described. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical. Here was a man who had spent his entire adult life in complete control. He decided who lived and who died. He commanded armies, built cities, and bent entire populations to his will. Now he couldn't control his own bowels, couldn't stop the smell emanating from his own body, couldn't make the itching stop for even a moment. The ultimate control freak was completely helpless against his own mortality. His appetite, what little remained, turned toward the bizarre. He craved unusual foods, then couldn't keep them down. He demanded specific delicacies from across the empire, only to vomit them up moments after eating. The royal kitchens, once temples to culinary artistry, became laboratories of desperation as cooks tried frantically to find something, anything, that the king could consume without immediately expelling it in one grotesque fashion or another. The fever that had started this nightmare never broke. It rose and fell like a tide, but it never went away. During the high points, Herod would become delirious, ranting about conspiracies, seeing enemies in shadows, ordering the execution of people who had been dead for years. During the lower points, he would be lucid enough to understand exactly what was happening to his body, which was arguably worse than the madness. His breathing became labored as his throat and chest began to swell. The man who had once delivered commanding speeches to massive crowds now could barely whisper. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as a raspy wheeze that servants had to strain to understand. Royal proclamations became desperate, barely audible pleas for relief that never came. The kingdom began to fracture as news of Herod's condition spread. When your king is literally rotting alive, it tends to create political instability. Rival claimants to the throne began positioning themselves. Foreign enemies started making aggressive moves, and the Roman overseers began wondering if it was time to find a replacement for their useful monster. But Herod, even in his deteriorating state, wasn't ready to give up power. He continued to issue orders, make decisions, and plot against perceived enemies right up until the end. His paranoia, always a defining characteristic, reached new heights during his illness. Every servant became a potential assassin, every physician a possible poisoner, every family member a threat to be eliminated. The fact that most of his family was already dead didn't stop him from imagining new conspiracies. He ordered the arrest and execution of anyone who showed even the slightest sign of disloyalty, which in his fevered mind included anyone who seemed too eager for his recovery or too accepting of his decline. The royal physicians, meanwhile, were running out of ideas and excuses. They had tried every treatment known to ancient medicine: bloodletting, purging exotic herbs, prayers to various gods, and consulting every medical text from Athens to Alexandria. Nothing worked. In fact, most treatments seemed to make things worse. The bloodletting weakened him further. The purging dehydrated his already failing body, and the exotic remedies often caused additional complications. Some of the bolder physicians began to hint that perhaps the king's condition might be divine punishment for his many crimes. After all, what mortal ailment could cause such comprehensive and symbolic suffering? The man who had made others suffer was now experiencing suffering beyond human imagination. The king who had turned his kingdom into a place of fear and death was now experiencing his own body as a kingdom of fear and death. But Herod wasn't interested in theological explanations. He wanted cures, and he was willing to try anything. He subjected himself to treatments that would have killed a healthy man's, scalding baths to stop the itching, caustic potions to kill the worms, surgical procedures without anesthesia to drain the constantly forming abscesses. Each treatment brought new agony without any relief from the existing torment. The servants who had to care for him developed their own elaborate rituals of protection. They would burn incense constantly to mask the smell, wear multiple layers of clothing to avoid direct contact with the king's diseased body, and say prayers to every god they could think of for protection from whatever curse had befallen their master. Some refused to enter the royal chambers at all, preferring execution to exposure to Herod's condition. The royal bathhouse, once a place of luxury and relaxation, became a chamber of horrors. The king would spend hours soaking in various concoctions designed to provide relief from the itching and smell. The water would have to be changed constantly as it became contaminated with blood, pus, and pieces of rotting flesh. The marble floors, once pristine white, became permanently stained with the evidence of the king's decay. Meanwhile, the palace kitchen struggled with an impossible task: preparing food for someone whose digestive system had essentially shut down. They tried everything from simple broths to exotic delicacies, but nothing stayed down. The royal dining room, once the scene of elaborate feasts and political negotiations, became a place where grown men wept as they watched their king vomit up everything he tried to consume. The king's bedchambers required constant attention from a rotating staff of servants who drew short straws for the duty. The linens had to be changed multiple times per day as they became soiled with various bodily fluids. The mattresses, even the finest ones money could buy, would become contaminated and have to be burned. The room itself had to be fumigated regularly, though no amount of incense or perfume could completely mask the smell of living decay. Herod's personal grooming, once a matter of royal pride, became an exercise in damage control. His barbers could no longer properly shave him because of the sores and swelling on his face. His bath servants couldn't properly clean him because touching his skin caused pieces of it to come off. His clothing had to be specially designed to accommodate his swollen limbs and to hide the worst of the visible decay. The psychological impact on the royal court was devastating. These were people who had spent their careers in service to a man they saw as divinely appointed, politically brilliant, and physically imposing. Now they were watching him dissolve before their eyes like a piece of meat left in the sun. Some became convinced that they were witnessing divine justice in action. Others worried that whatever had befallen the king might be contagious. Religious leaders across the kingdom interpreted Herod's condition as everything from divine punishment to demonic possession to a test of faith. Jewish rabbis pointed to his many violations of religious law and his murders of innocents as obvious causes for divine wrath. Greek philosophers discussed it as an example of how the gods humble those who become too proud. Roman pragmatists simply wondered when they would need to install a replacement. The economic impact of the king's illness was almost as devastating as the physical horror. Trade relationships suffered because foreign merchants didn't want to deal with a kingdom whose ruler might die at any moment. Construction projects, Herod's passion and legacy, ground to a halt because no one wanted to make long-term commitments to a dying king's vision. The elaborate bureaucracy that kept the kingdom functioning began to break down as officials positioned themselves for the inevitable succession crisis. Herod's attempts to maintain royal dignity in the face of his condition were both tragic and absurd. He would still try to hold court, though he could barely speak, and his appearance was so horrifying that many courtiers couldn't look directly at him. He would attempt to review military reports while servants held containers nearby for his inevitable vomiting. He tried to continue his architectural projects even as his own body was falling apart stone by stone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The king who had built monuments designed to last forever was watching his own body crumble in real time. The man who had created beautiful palaces was living in a body that had become uglier than any slum. The ruler, who had controlled the fates of thousands, couldn't control his own bladder. His sleep, what little he could manage, was filled with nightmares that were probably less horrifying than his waking reality. He would dream of being consumed by various creatures, of rotting in public while his subjects laughed, of his enemies celebrating his suffering. Then he would wake up to discover that his dreams weren't metaphorical, they were prophecies. The king's relationship with food became increasingly bizarre as his condition worsened. He would crave specific dishes with desperate intensity, then be unable to consume them when they arrived. He became obsessed with the idea that the right meal might cure him, leading to increasingly elaborate and exotic preparations that inevitably ended up being vomited across the royal dining room. His bowel movements, once a private royal function, became public events that required entire teams to manage. The smell alone could clear rooms, and the cleanup required specialized tools and techniques that palace staff had to develop through trial and error. The royal physicians began to examine these productions with the intensity of ancient forensic scientists, looking for clues about the king's condition and finding only further evidence of his body's complete rebellion. The swelling that had started in his extremities began to spread to his internal organs. His liver became enlarged and hardened. His spleen swelled to the point where it was visible through his distended abdomen, and his kidneys began to fail, turning his urine dark and foul-smelling. Each organ system seemed to be competing to see which could fail most dramatically. His skin, once the healthy bronze of a man who spent time in Mediterranean sunshine, became a patchwork of colors that no human skin should ever display. There were areas of normal flesh next to patches of angry red inflammation, sections of dead grey tissue, and spots where the skin had simply sloughed off entirely, revealing the raw, weeping flesh beneath. The worms that had initially appeared in his genitals began to colonize other parts of his body. They would emerge from any open wound or sore, creating a constantly moving landscape of parasitic activity that made even the most hardened servants physically ill to observe. Whether these were actual parasites or just the medieval way of describing necrotic tissue breakdown, the effect was the same. The king's body had become an ecosystem unto itself. His breathing became increasingly labored as his throat continued to swell and his lungs began to fill with fluid. The man who had once roared commands across battlefields now could barely whisper orders to servants who had to lean in close, fighting their gag reflexes to understand his words. His voice, when it came at all, sounded like air escaping from a punctured bladder. The royal physicians, desperate to show some form of progress, began to document every symptom, every change, every attempted treatment with obsessive detail. These records, thankfully lost to history in their full form, apparently contained descriptions that were so graphic and disturbing that even ancient historians, not known for their squeamishness, had to sanitize them for public consumption. Herod's attempts to maintain political control became increasingly frantic and paranoid as his physical control deteriorated. He issued contradictory orders, appointed and executed officials in the same day, and became convinced that everyone around him was plotting to accelerate his death. The fact that many probably were hoping for exactly that didn't make his paranoia any less destructive to the functioning of the kingdom. The royal guards, once proud soldiers who served a strong and feared king, now found themselves protecting a man who had become more horror than human. They had to maintain their professional composure while their commander literally fell apart before their eyes. Some requested transfers to distant outposts, others simply deserted. The few who remained were motivated more by professional duty than any remaining loyalty to the man Herod had become. His personal servants developed elaborate protocols for dealing with the various fluids and solids that constantly emerged from the king's body. They created specialized cleaning equipment, established rotation schedules to prevent any one person from being exposed too long, and developed a complex system of signals to communicate about the king's condition without having to speak about it directly. The palace became a place where normal life couldn't exist. The constant smell, the sounds of the king's suffering, and the knowledge that death was stalking the corridors created an atmosphere that was more like a charnel house than a royal residence. Visitors, when they came at all, would leave as quickly as possible, often becoming physically ill from the experience. Herod's relationship with his remaining family members became even more strained during his illness. Those who hadn't been executed yet found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't appear too eager for his death. but they also couldn't pretend that his condition wasn't horrifying. Some tried to maintain normal family relationships, visiting the king and attempting conversation, but these encounters usually ended with everyone involved traumatized. The king's attempts to maintain his appearance became increasingly futile as his condition worsened. His barbers could no longer properly groom him because touching his face caused skin to come away on their tools. His clothing had to be specially designed to accommodate his swollen limbs and to contain the various fluids his body was constantly producing. His jewelry, once symbols of power and wealth, now served mainly to distract from the horror of his physical condition. His diet became a series of increasingly desperate experiments as his digestive system continued to shut down. The royal cooks tried everything from simple water to exotic delicacies from across the empire, but nothing stayed down for long. The king would demand specific foods with desperate intensity, then be unable to consume them when they arrived, leading to scenes of rage and frustration that were heartbreaking to witness. The smell emanating from the king's body became so intense that it began to permeate the entire palace complex. Servants would burn incense constantly, but the sweet smoke only created a sickly combination that was somehow worse than the original odor. Guests would arrive at the palace and know immediately from the smell that they were entering a place where death was already partially victorious. Herod's sleep patterns, already disrupted by pain and discomfort, became completely chaotic as his condition worsened. He would sometimes remain awake for days at a time, driven by pain and fever-induced delirium, then collapse into unconsciousness for hours, during which his servants would desperately try to clean and care for his deteriorating body. The king's bowel and bladder control, once matters of simple bodily function, became sources of constant humiliation and practical difficulty. The royal chambers required constant cleaning, and the king had to be attended to like an infant, a situation that was psychologically devastating for a man who had spent his life in absolute control. His fever continued to rage throughout his illness, sometimes reaching heights that should have killed him, but somehow didn't. During the worst episodes, he would become delirious, ranting about enemies who had been dead for years, giving orders for construction projects that existed only in his fevered imagination, and begging for relief from gods he had never believed in. The political implications of Herod's condition began to affect the entire region. Neighboring kingdoms started making aggressive moves, sensing weakness. Roman officials began to discuss succession plans. The kingdom's internal stability started to crumble as various factions positioned themselves for the power struggle that would inevitably follow the king's death. The royal court, once a place of sophisticated political maneuvering and cultural achievement, became a gathering of people united only by their shared trauma of witnessing their king's decomposition. Conversations became strained and artificial as everyone tried to avoid acknowledging the obvious reality of what was happening to Herod. His personal hygiene, once a matter of royal pride maintained by teams of skilled servants, became an exercise in damage control. Bathing the king became a horrifying ordeal that left servants traumatized and often physically ill. The bathwater would become contaminated within minutes, requiring constant changing and eventually leading to the abandonment of regular bathing altogether. The king's relationship with his physicians became increasingly hostile as it became clear that they had no solutions to offer. He would rage at them for their failures, then beg them for relief, then threaten them with execution if they couldn't cure him. Several physicians fled the kingdom rather than continue to witness and participate in the king's suffering. Herod's attempts to continue his building projects curing his illness created surreal situations where architectural plans were being discussed by a man whose own body was falling apart. He would try to review construction progress while servants held containers for his inevitable vomiting, creating scenes that were both tragic and absurd. The psychological impact of his condition extended beyond the physical symptoms. The king, who had always been in complete control, was now completely helpless. The man who had decided the fates of thousands couldn't control his own bladder. The ruler who had built monuments to last forever was watching his own body crumble in real time. His voice, once capable of commanding armies and terrorizing enemies, became a whispered rasp that servants had to strain to understand. Royal proclamations became desperate, barely audible pleas for relief that never came. The man who had once roared his displeasure across battlefields now could barely whisper his agony to the servants who tried to care for him. The smell of his condition became so pervasive that it began to affect the entire palace complex. Fresh flowers wilted within hours of being brought into the royal quarters. Food spoiled faster than normal when prepared in the palace kitchens. Even the stone walls seemed to absorb and hold the odor of decay, creating an atmosphere that was more reminiscent of a tomb than a royal residence. His eating habits became increasingly bizarre as his digestive system continued to fail. He would crave specific foods with desperate intensity, demanding delicacies from across the empire, only to be unable to consume them when they arrived. The royal kitchens became laboratories of desperation as cooks tried frantically to find something, anything, that the king could consume without immediately expelling it. The king's bowel movements, once private royal functions, became public health crises that required teams of servants to manage. The cleanup process became so complex and traumatic that the palace had to develop entirely new protocols and equipment. Servants would draw straws to determine who would have to deal with the aftermath of the king's bodily functions. His sleep, what little he could manage, became filled with nightmares that were probably less horrifying than his waking reality. He would dream of being consumed by worms, of rotting in public while his subjects laughed, of his enemies celebrating his suffering. Then he would wake up to discover that his nightmares were actually happening. The swelling that had begun in his extremities spread throughout his body, creating a grotesque parody of human anatomy. His face became so distorted that many people couldn't recognize him. His hands and feet swelled to the point where he couldn't use them effectively. His entire body became a bloated, unrecognizable mass that bore little resemblance to the commanding figure he had once been. The worms that infested his body created a constantly changing landscape of horror that fascinated and repulsed observers in equal measure. They would emerge from any opening in his skin, creating movement that made it appear as though his body was alive with parasitic activity. Whether these were actual worms or just the ancient way of describing tissue necrosis, the effect was the same. The king's body had become an ecosystem of decay. The royal physicians, desperate to show some form of progress, began to try increasingly extreme treatments. They subjected the king to procedures that would have killed a healthy man, scalding baths to stop the itching, caustic chemicals to kill the parasites, surgical interventions without effective anesthesia. Each treatment brought new agony without providing any relief from the existing torment. His breathing became increasingly labored as fluid accumulated in his lungs and his throat continued to swell. The sound of his respiration became a constant reminder to everyone in the palace that death was approaching. His breath, when it could be detected at all, carried the smell of internal decay that made close conversation impossible. The king's attempts to maintain royal dignity became both tragic and futile as his condition worsened. He would try to hold court while barely able to speak, attempt to review military reports while vomiting into containers held by servants, and struggle to maintain the appearance of leadership while his body visibly decomposed. His personal servants developed their own trauma responses to caring for the dying king. Some became obsessively focused on cleanliness, washing themselves and their clothes constantly. Others developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to protect them from whatever curse had befallen their master. Many simply requested transfers to other duties, preferring any other assignment to caring for the rotting king. The palace kitchens, once centers of culinary artistry that produced elaborate feasts for hundreds of guests, became focused entirely on the impossible task of finding something the king could consume. Cooks would prepare dozens of different dishes each day, watching helplessly as each one was rejected by the king's failing digestive system. His relationship with his remaining family members became strained beyond repair during his illness. The few relatives who hadn't been executed found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't appear eager for his death, but they also couldn't pretend that his condition wasn't horrifying. Family visits became exercises in mutual trauma that left everyone involved emotionally scarred. The king's personal grooming, once a matter of royal pride maintained by skilled servants, became an exercise in damage control that often caused more harm than good. Attempting to wash him would cause pieces of skin to come away. Trying to dress him would aggravate his sores and cause new ones to form. His appearance became so horrifying that mirrors were removed from his chambers to prevent him from seeing his own reflection. The political ramifications of his condition began to affect international relations as news of his illness spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Allied kingdoms began to distance themselves from Judea, not wanting to be associated with a ruler who was literally rotting alive. Enemy nations began to make aggressive moves, sensing weakness and opportunity. His attempts to continue governing became increasingly surreal as his physical condition deteriorated. He would try to make political decisions while struggling with basic bodily functions, attempt to conduct diplomatic meetings while servants cleaned up after his various omissions, and struggle to maintain the appearance of leadership while clearly dying in the most horrific way possible. The royal guards, once proud soldiers who had served a strong and feared leader, now found themselves protecting a man who had become more horror than human. They had to maintain their professional composure while their commander literally fell apart before their eyes. Many requested transfers, and some simply deserted rather than continue to witness the king's decomposition. Herod's voice, when it functioned at all, became increasingly difficult to understand as his throat continued to swell and fluid accumulated in his chest. Royal proclamations became desperate whispers that had to be interpreted and repeated by servants who could barely understand them themselves. The man who had once commanded through the power of his voice was reduced to communicating through gestures and expressions that were often misunderstood. The smell emanating from his body became so intense that it began to affect the structural elements of the palace itself. Stone absorbed the odor, wood became saturated with it, and fabrics had to be burned rather than cleaned because the smell could never be completely removed. The palace became a monument to decay that would carry the odor of the king's death long after he was gone. His eating attempts became increasingly desperate and futile as his digestive system shut down completely. He would demand specific foods with the intensity of a dying man's last wish, only to find himself unable to consume them when they arrived. The royal dining room became a place of constant disappointment and increasing desperation as meal after meal was rejected by his failing body. The king's bowel and bladder functions became so unpredictable and voluminous that the palace had to develop entirely new cleaning protocols and equipment. Servants wore multiple layers of protective clothing, used specialized tools to minimize direct contact, and followed elaborate decontamination procedures after each encounter with the king's bodily waste. His sleep patterns became completely chaotic as pain, fever, and delirium made rest impossible. He would sometimes remain conscious for days at a time, driven by agony and hallucinations, then collapse into unconsciousness for hours while his body continued its relentless process of decay. Even unconscious, he would moan and move restlessly, as though his body couldn't find peace even in oblivion. The psychological impact of witnessing the king's condition created a climate of trauma throughout the palace complex. Servants developed nervous disorders. Officials began making mistakes in their duties, and the general atmosphere became one of depression and horror. The palace, once a center of power and culture, became a place where normal human activity couldn't function. His personal hygiene became completely impossible to maintain as his condition worsened. Any attempt to clean his body would cause further damage, and the various fluids he was constantly producing made it impossible to keep him dry or comfortable. He became encrusted with the products of his own decay, creating additional layers of horror for anyone who had to interact with him. The king's attempts to maintain control over his kingdom became increasingly frantic and irrational as his physical control deteriorated. He would issue contradictory orders, appoint and execute officials within the same day, and become convinced that everyone around him was conspiring to hasten his death. His paranoia, always a defining characteristic, reached new heights as his body failed. And then, finally, mercifully, it ended. After months of suffering that would have broken lesser men in days, after enduring pain that had no name and horror that had no precedent, Herod the Great died. The exact date was sometime in 4 BCE, just days after he had ordered the execution of his son Antipater, because apparently even death couldn't stop his paranoia. But here's the truly twisted part: even in death, Herod managed to inflict one final act of cruelty. Knowing that his death would be celebrated by his subjects, he ordered that upon his death, prominent citizens from across the kingdom should be executed so that there would be mourning instead of celebration. Fortunately, this order was ignored by his successors, but it perfectly captured the essence of a man who couldn't bear the thought that anyone might be happy about his demise. The autopsy, such as it was in ancient times, revealed a body that had been completely destroyed from within. His internal organs had been consumed by disease. His tissues had rotted while he was still alive, and his body had become a living example of what happens when mortality catches up with immortal ambitions. The physicians who examined his corpse were reportedly so horrified by what they found that several refused to complete the examination. His funeral was a spectacle of mixed emotions. There was the required mourning for a dead king, but also a palpable sense of relief that the nightmare was finally over. The body had to be prepared for burial quickly, because the smell of decay was so intense that it was affecting everyone who came near the funeral preparations. Even in death, Herod continued to be a problem that needed to be managed. The kingdom he left behind was fractured, traumatized, and exhausted by years of tyranny followed by months of witnessing their ruler's horrific decline. His architectural legacy would endure: the expanded Temple Mount, the palace at Masada, the harbour at Caesarea, but his human legacy was one of fear, paranoia, and ultimately, a death so horrible that it became a cautionary tale for future generations. Modern medicine has attempted to diagnose Herod's condition based on the historical accounts, with theories ranging from chronic kidney disease to Fournier's gangrene to various parasitic infections. But the exact medical explanation matters less than the historical impact. Here was a man who had everything: absolute power, unlimited wealth, architectural genius, political cunning, and none of it could save him from a death that was worse than anything he had inflicted on his enemies. The irony was perfect and terrible. The king who had ruled through fear experienced terror beyond imagination. The man who had caused others to suffer endured suffering that had no equal. The ruler who had decided who lived and died discovered that death doesn't respect titles, crowns, or the ability to have people executed. In the end, Herod the Great became Herod the Cautionary Tale, a reminder that no matter how much power you accumulate, your body is still just meat, and meat spoils. His death marked the end of an era, and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Judea, one that would eventually include a certain carpenter from Nazareth who would have very different ideas about power, mortality, and what it means to be great. But that's another story entirely. This one ends with a king who rotted alive, alone in his palace, surrounded by the smell of his own decay. Having learned too late that the only kingdom you can never truly control is your own body. And perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for Herod the Great. He built monuments that lasted for millennia, but he couldn't build a body that would last even his natural lifespan without becoming a horror show that traumatized everyone who witnessed it. In trying to become immortal through his achievements, he became immortally infamous through his death. Sometimes, the universe has a sense of humor. It's just not very nice. The aftermath of Herod's death created its own unique horror show, because apparently even being dead wasn't going to stop him from being a problem. His body, which had been decomposing while he was still alive, didn't improve with actual death. If anything, it got worse, faster, like a biological time bomb that had finally been allowed to explode without the inconvenience of keeping the victim conscious. The embalmers who were called to prepare the royal corpse for burial took one look at their assignment and probably wished they had chosen literally any other profession. These were men who had spent their careers making dead people look presentable for their final public appearances, but Herod's corpse was beyond their considerable skills. It was like being asked to restore a painting that had been left in a swamp for several months, except the painting was still actively decomposing. The funeral preparations became a logistical nightmare that tested the organizational skills of the entire royal court. How do you give a proper royal send off to a body that has become a biohazard? How do you maintain the dignity of state ceremony when the guest of honor is literally falling apart? The answer, it turned out, was very carefully and very quickly. The royal chambers where Herod had spent his final months had to be completely gutted after his death. The smell had penetrated so deeply into the stone and wood that no amount of cleaning could remove it. Servants who had cared for the king during his illness reported that the odor lingered in their nostrils for weeks after his death, as though their bodies had absorbed some essence of the royal decay. His personal effects became a disposal problem of epic proportions. Clothing, bedding, furniture, even jewelry that had come into contact with the king's body during his illness had to be destroyed. The palace held what was essentially a bonfire of royal possessions, burning items worth fortunes because they were too contaminated to be preserved or given away. The succession crisis that followed Herod's death was complicated by the fact that several of his designated heirs had been executed during his final paranoid months. The man who had spent decades planning for every possible threat to his power had managed to eliminate most of his own succession options through his own murderous paranoia. It was like a final practical joke from beyond the grave. The servants who had cared for Herod during his final illness became a traumatized group who shared an experience that no one else could understand. They had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of human mortality and divine justice. Some left the palace entirely, unable to continue working in a place where they had seen such horror. Others stayed, but were never quite the same, carrying the psychological scars of having witnessed a death that seemed more like divine punishment than natural mortality. The palace physicians who had failed to cure the king found themselves in an awkward position after his death. They had promised cures they couldn't deliver, charged fees for treatments that didn't work, and ultimately presided over one of the most horrific medical failures in recorded history. Some fled the kingdom to avoid questions about their competence. Others tried to distance themselves from the case by claiming they had been working under impossible conditions. The political implications of Herod's manner of death extended far beyond Judea. The story spread throughout the Roman world, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the inevitability of divine justice. Roman officials began to wonder if supporting rulers like Herod was worth the risk of being associated with such obvious moral corruption. Religious leaders across the region interpreted Herod's death as confirmation of their various theological positions. Jewish rabbis saw it as proof that God punishes those who violate his laws. Greek philosophers used it as an example of how hubris leads to nemesis. Christian writers, looking back on the event decades later, saw it as divine retribution for the massacre of the innocents. The medical community of the ancient world was baffled by Herod's condition, and his case became a subject of study and speculation for generations of physicians. They had never seen anything like it, and they couldn't explain how someone could suffer so extensively while remaining alive for so long. Some theorized about divine intervention, others about unknown diseases, but none could provide a satisfactory medical explanation. The economic impact of Herod's prolonged illness and horrific death extended throughout the kingdom and beyond. Trade relationships suffered because merchants didn't want to be associated with a place where such obvious divine disfavor was being displayed. Construction projects ground to a halt, not just because of political uncertainty, but because workers were superstitious about laboring on behalf of a cursed king. The palace complex itself became a place that people avoided whenever possible, even after extensive cleaning and renovation. Stories about what had happened there made it an uncomfortable place to visit or work. The royal quarters where Herod had suffered and died acquired a reputation for being haunted, not by ghosts exactly, but by the memory of suffering so intense that it seemed to have soaked into the very stones. The historical accounts of Herod's death, written by Josephus and others, became some of the most graphic and disturbing passages in ancient literature. These writers, not known for their squeamishness, felt compelled to document the horror in detail, perhaps because they understood that future generations would find it difficult to believe that anyone could suffer and die in such a manner. The legacy of Herod's death extended into Christian tradition, where it became associated with divine justice and the fate of those who oppose God's will. The timing of his death, shortly after the traditional date of Christ's birth and following the massacre of the innocents, made it particularly significant to early Christian writers who saw it as confirmation of divine protection for the infant Jesus. The psychological impact on the broader population was significant. Here was a king who had seemed invincible, who had built massive fortifications and commanded powerful armies, reduced to a rotting corpse who died in agony. It was a demonstration of human mortality that was both terrifying and somehow reassuring to people who had lived under his tyrannical rule. The medical theories that emerged to explain Herod's condition ranged from the supernatural to the practical. Some physicians theorized about curses and divine punishment. Others suggested various combinations of known diseases. A few proposed that his condition might have been caused by poisoning, though the symptoms were unlike any known poison of the time. The servants who had witnessed the king's decline developed their own folklore about what they had experienced. They created stories and explanations that helped them process the trauma of having cared for someone who had suffered so extremely. These stories, passed down through generations of palace staff, became part of the unofficial history of Herod's reign. The clean-up efforts after Herod's death were massive and comprehensive. Every surface that had come into contact with the king during his illness had to be scrubbed, disinfected, or destroyed. The process took months and required the efforts of hundreds of workers who had to be convinced to enter the contaminated areas of the palace. The burial itself was a carefully orchestrated event designed to hide the reality of Herod's condition from the public. His body was wrapped in multiple layers of expensive cloth, placed in a sealed sarcophagus, and buried quickly to prevent the smell from becoming obvious to the mourners. Even in death, maintaining the illusion of royal dignity required elaborate deception. The succession struggle that followed Herod's death was complicated by the fact that potential heirs had to overcome not just political opposition, but also the psychological impact of having witnessed their predecessor's horrific decline. Several potential successors were reportedly traumatized by what they had seen, and were less eager to claim the throne than they might otherwise have been. The palace staff who remained after Herod's death had to undergo a process of psychological recovery that the ancient world was ill-equipped to provide. They had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of human mortality and divine justice. Some developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress, though such concepts didn't exist in their time. The international reputation of Judea suffered as stories of Herod's death spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The kingdom became associated with divine curse and unnatural suffering, making it a less attractive ally and a more dangerous enemy. Foreign diplomats were reluctant to visit a place where such obvious supernatural disapproval was being displayed. The architectural projects that had been Herod's passion and legacy took on new meaning after his death. Structures that had been built to demonstrate his power and ensure his immortality became monuments to the futility of human ambition. Workers who had labored on these projects began to see them differently, as reminders of how even the greatest builders are ultimately subject to decay. The medical knowledge of the time was completely inadequate to explain or treat Herod's condition, leading to a sense of helplessness among the physicians who attended him. They had tried every treatment known to their era and had failed completely, creating a crisis of confidence in the medical profession that extended far beyond the individual case. The religious implications of Herod's death resonated throughout the ancient world for generations. It became a standard example of divine justice in action, proof that no earthly power could protect someone from the consequences of their actions. Religious teachers across multiple faiths used his death as an illustration of moral principles and divine authority. The trauma experienced by those who witnessed Herod's decline created a shared bond among survivors that lasted for years after his death. They had seen something that few humans have ever witnessed: the complete physical breakdown of another person, while that person remained conscious and aware. This shared experience created relationships and understanding that transcended normal social boundaries. The palace became a place of pilgrimage for those curious about the scene of such famous suffering, though most visitors left quickly after experiencing the lingering atmosphere of decay and death. Even years after the king's death, people reported feeling uncomfortable and disturbed when visiting the chambers where he had spent his final months. The economic recovery of the kingdom was slow and difficult, partly because of political uncertainty, but also because of the psychological impact of having witnessed their ruler's horrific demise. Trade relationships had to be rebuilt, construction projects had to be restarted, and the general confidence in royal authority had to be restored after such a dramatic demonstration of royal mortality. The story of Herod's death became a cautionary tale that was told throughout the ancient world for generations. It was used to illustrate the dangers of absolute power, the inevitability of divine justice, and the ultimate equality of all humans in the face of death. Parents would tell the story to children as a moral lesson, though probably in significantly sanitized versions. The medical mystery of exactly what killed Herod in such a horrible manner continued to fascinate scholars for centuries. Ancient physicians wrote treatises attempting to explain his condition. Medieval doctors used his case to illustrate various theories about disease and divine punishment, and modern medical researchers still debate the exact diagnosis based on the historical descriptions. And so the man who had tried to make himself immortal through monuments and murder became immortal in an entirely different way, as history's most famous example of how power, wealth, and fear can't protect you from the fundamental reality that all human bodies are temporary vessels that will eventually betray their owners in the most intimate and humiliating ways possible. Herod the Great died as he had lived, making everyone around him miserable, except this time he was making himself miserable too, and there was absolutely nothing his money, power, or paranoia could do to stop it. The universe, it seemed, had been saving up its cruelest joke for a king who thought he was above the normal rules of human mortality. The punchline took months to deliver, but when it finally arrived, it was so perfectly, horribly appropriate that even the gods probably couldn't help but appreciate the cosmic justice of it all.